The bustling city hummed with activity as people rushed through the streets, their lives a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and distractions. Amidst the chaos, a young homeless girl named Ivy roamed the sidewalks. At just 20, her life had already been a series of relentless struggles, marked by loss and survival. Her figure, thin and wiry, bore the signs of hardship. Yet there was an undeniable spark in her deep green eyes. Ivy wasn't just another invisible figure on the streets, her voice set her apart. Ivy lived off the coins dropped into her upturned hat while she sang in subway stations and underpasses. Her voice had a haunting beauty, carrying the pain of her past and the remnants of the dreams she once had. She'd been a child prodigy, destined for a future in music, before her mother's death and an ensuing series of misfortunes drove her to the streets. Her melodies, though unpolished, carried an emotional resonance that stopped even the busiest commuters in their tracks, if only for a moment. But Ivy's life was far from glamorous. The day ended with her retreating to a makeshift shelter behind a row of abandoned buildings, clutching her guitar like a lifeline. On this particular evening, Ivy found herself near a high-profile gala event being held in a lavish city park. The gathering was in memory of Julian Kane, the only son of the billionaire philanthropist Arthur Kane. Julian had died a year ago under mysterious circumstances, and his death had left a gaping hole in his father's life. Arthur, a man who had once ruled the business world with an iron will, had retreated into himself after the tragedy. Now, his focus was entirely on commemorating Julian's legacy, establishing scholarships, and funding art projects in his son's name. Arthur Kane was a complex figure. In his prime, he was celebrated as a titan of industry, a man whose charisma and vision had built an empire from nothing. Yet beneath the surface, he had always struggled to connect emotionally with his family. Julian, a free-spirited and gifted musician, had been the polar opposite of his father. While Arthur had seen the world in terms of deals and profits, Julian had seen it as a canvas for creation. Their relationship had been strained, but Arthur's love for his son was undeniable. Julian's death, however, had left him with an overwhelming sense of guilt, and he had poured his wealth into preserving his son's memory, though it never filled the void. The gala in the park was one such effort. The wealthy and influential gathered under the glittering lights strung between ancient oaks, sipping champagne and exchanging pleasantries. A live orchestra played Julian's compositions, their notes drifting into the cool evening air. For Arthur, this wasn't just an event, it was a desperate attempt to keep Julian alive in some way. While the city's elite celebrated Julian's legacy, Ivy wandered near the park's edge, drawn by the distant sound of the music. Her stomach growled, and her jacket, worn thin by years of use, did little to shield her from the crisp breeze. She scanned the crowd from a distance, not daring to approach the gates, which were guarded by suited men with earpieces. Yet, as she turned to leave, something glinted under the light of a nearby lamppost. Curious, she stepped closer and knelt down. It was a necklace, a stunning piece of jewelry with a diamond centerpiece that sparkled like a fragment of the night sky. The diamond was enormous, its facets catching and refracting every sliver of light. The necklace was nestled in a small, velvety pouch, carelessly dropped and forgotten. Ivy's breath caught as she held it in her hands. She'd never seen anything so beautiful, let alone touched it. For a moment, a flicker of temptation crossed her mind. This necklace could change everything. She could sell it, escape the streets, and start over. But something held her back. The thought of keeping it felt wrong, like it didn't belong to her story. Clutching the pouch tightly, Ivy wandered through the crowd gathered outside the park gates, trying to find its owner. Overhearing snippets of conversations, she learned that the necklace was part of a collection once owned by Julian Kane. It had been passed down through his family and was now considered a priceless heirloom. Ivy hesitated. She was just a nobody, a girl who barely had a roof over her head. Who would believe her if she walked up to one of those rich people and claimed she'd found such a valuable item? But the more she thought about it, the more her conscience gnawed at her. This wasn't hers to keep. Julian's story, which she overheard in fragments from the gala goers, resonated with her. Like her, he'd been a musician with dreams of leaving a mark on the world, though their lives had diverged drastically. Julian had grown up with wealth and opportunity, but both of them had found solace in music. She couldn't shake the feeling that this necklace was a piece of him. something that had to go back where it belonged. Summoning her courage, Ivy waited until the crowd began to thin out, and she approached one of the security guards at the gate. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I think this belongs to Mr. Kane." The guard looked her up and down, his gaze skeptical. "You're saying you found this? A necklace like that?" "Yes," Ivy replied firmly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I just want to return it." Reluctantly, the guard called someone on his earpiece, and within minutes, Ivy was ushered through the gates and into the opulent venue. The sight of the gala stunned her, the chandeliers strung between the trees, the elegant guests in their evening gowns and tailored suits, and the soft glow of candlelight reflected in crystal glasses. She felt completely out of place, a tattered shadow amidst a sea of perfection. Finally, she was brought before Arthur Kane. He stood apart from the crowd, his towering frame silhouetted against the soft glow of a nearby fountain. His face, etched with grief and weariness, turned toward her as the guard explained the situation. Arthur's piercing blue eyes studied her intently, and for a moment Ivy felt exposed, as though he could see through her rough exterior and into her soul. "You found this?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy with an unspoken weight. "Yes," Ivy replied, holding out the necklace. "I thought it might be yours." Arthur took the pouch and opened it, his expression softening as he gazed at the necklace. For a brief moment, a flicker of something gratitude perhaps crossed his face. "Thank you," he said simply, though his tone carried an unexpected sincerity. Ivy nodded, unsure of what to say. She turned to leave, but Arthur's voice stopped her. "Wait." She looked back, meeting his gaze. "What's your name?" "Ivy," she said softly. Arthur hesitated before speaking again. "How did you come by this? And that melody you were humming earlier, where did you learn it?" Ivy blinked, caught off guard. "It's just something I've always known. I don't even remember where I heard it first." Arthur's expression darkened, and his grip on the necklace tightened. That melody, he recognized it. It was one of Julian's unfinished compositions, something he'd never released publicly. For the first time in a long while, Arthur felt a spark of curiosity pierce through the fog of his grief. Who was this girl? And how could she know something so intimately tied to his son? The night wasn't over yet, and Arthur Kane was determined to find out. The gilded gates of the Kane estate creaked open, revealing the grandeur that lay beyond. Ivy's heart pounded as she walked through, her worn sneakers treading cautiously on the pristine cobblestone driveway. It felt like stepping into another world, one she didn't belong to. The opulent garden stretched out before her, lit by carefully placed lanterns and the soft glow of moonlight. In the distance, the Kane mansion loomed, its tall, arched windows flickering with the light of chandeliers. She clutched the strap of her guitar case nervously, her other hand still tingling from the moment she had handed Arthur Kane his son's necklace. Ivy had expected her interaction with Arthur to end at the gates. But now, with a soft command to one of his security guards, Arthur had instructed her to be brought to the study. The sheer weight of his gaze as he'd asked about the melody she had hummed haunted her. It wasn't just curiosity in his eyes, it was something deeper, sharper, and far more personal. The study was unlike anything Ivy had ever seen. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound tomes that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A grand piano sat in the corner, its polished surface reflecting the warm golden light of the room. Above the mantelpiece hung a portrait of Julian Kane. He looked radiant, with a slight smile that suggested a love for mischief and an unwavering confidence. His blue eyes seemed to follow Ivy as she stepped inside. Arthur entered moments later, his imposing figure silhouetted by the double doors. For a man of such wealth and power, he carried an air of weariness that seemed to age him beyond his years. His movements were deliberate, his expression inscrutable. He gestured for her to sit on the leather armchair opposite his desk. For a moment there was silence. Arthur studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Ivy fidgeted under his gaze, suddenly hyper-aware of her patched jacket, fraying jeans, and the dirt on her fingernails. She was nothing like the polished, well-dressed people she'd seen at the gala. "You said the melody you hummed earlier, you've always known it?" Arthur asked, his voice low but firm. Ivy nodded. It's been in my head for as long as I can remember. I thought I might have made it up, but sometimes I feel like I heard it somewhere, a long time ago." Arthur leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "That melody," he said slowly, "was something my son Julian composed, but it was never released. It wasn't even finished." Ivy's heart skipped a beat. I don't know how I know it," she said honestly. "Maybe I heard it once when I was a kid." Arthur's gaze hardened, though not with anger. "That's impossible. Julian recorded it privately. Only a handful of people could have ever heard it, and you're not one of them." Ivy opened her mouth to respond but hesitated. Something about his tone told her that he wasn't accusing her, he was trying to piece something together. "Maybe it's just a coincidence," she offered, though even as the words left her mouth they felt hollow. She had no explanation for how a song so deeply personal to Julian Kane could have imprinted itself in her memory. Arthur sat back, his eyes flickering to the necklace now lying on his desk. "This necklace," he said, almost to himself. It was Julian's favorite. He always said it reminded him of the first time he fell in love with music. "It's a family heirloom, but to him it meant more than its worth. He never went anywhere without it." His voice faltered slightly, as though he were speaking more to Julian than to Ivy. He looked back at Ivy. "Where exactly did you find it?" "Near the park," Ivy replied. "It was just lying on the ground. I didn't know it was yours at first, but when I heard people at the gala talking about it, I figured I had to return it." Arthur was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled as he stared at the necklace. "If you found it in the park, it shouldn't have been there," he said finally. "That necklace was lost the night Julian died." Ivy felt a chill run down her spine. "I don't understand. How could it just show up now?" "That's what I intend to find out," Arthur said, his tone resolute. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window and looking out over the sprawling estate. Julian's death was ruled an accident, but there were inconsistencies, questions that were never answered. And now this necklace, tied so closely to him, appears in the hands of a homeless girl who hums a song only he knew. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ivy's instinct was to back away, to excuse herself from whatever strange web she'd stumbled into. But something about Arthur's raw grief and the mystery surrounding Julian's death rooted her to the spot. Arthur turned to her, his eyes sharp. "I don't believe in coincidences, Ivy. There's something connecting you to my son, and I intend to find out what it is." Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. One of Arthur's assistants entered, carrying a small envelope. "This just arrived for you, sir," the assistant said, handing it to him before exiting as swiftly as she had come. Arthur opened the envelope, his expression darkening as he scanned its contents. He handed the paper to Ivy without a word. It was a typed note, unsigned, that read, "She knows more than she's letting on. Watch her closely, or you'll lose another Kane." Ivy's blood ran cold. Who sent this?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but this changes everything." The hours that followed were a blur for Ivy. Arthur insisted that she stay at the estate for her safety, though she couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching her as much as he was protecting her. She spent the night in one of the guest rooms, a space more luxurious than anything she had ever experienced. The bed was soft, the air smelled faintly of lavender, and there was a warmth that made her almost forget the chill of sleeping on the streets. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind raced with questions. How had she come to know Julian's melody? Why had the necklace appeared when it did? And who would send a threatening note about her to Arthur? By morning, Ivy resolved to leave. This wasn't her world, and whatever mysteries surrounded Julian Kane were far beyond her understanding. She packed her few belongings, including her guitar, and crept through the halls of the mansion. But as she reached the front door, Arthur was waiting for her. "You were planning to leave without saying anything?" he asked, his tone calm but carrying an edge of disappointment. "I don't belong here," Ivy said. This isn't my life. I don't know how I got caught up in all this, but I can't help you." Arthur studied her for a moment before speaking, If you walk away now, you'll always wonder. About the melody. About the necklace. About Julian. You may not think this is your life, but you're already a part of it. Ivy hesitated. He wasn't wrong. As much as she wanted to run, something deep inside her wouldn't let her. Fine, she said finally, I'll stay, but only until we figure out what's going on. Arthur nodded, a hint of satisfaction in his expression. Good. Because I think the answers we're looking for aren't just about Julian. They're about you too. It was a cryptic statement, one that left Ivy uneasy. But she didn't have time to dwell on it. Arthur had already turned toward the study, motioning for her to follow. The search for answers had only just begun. The Kane estate had always felt like a fortress, imposing, grand, and impenetrable. Yet to Ivy, it felt like a gilded cage. Days turned into a strange routine as Arthur insisted she remain on the property for her safety. She spent hours in the garden, practicing melodies on her guitar while her mind reeled with unanswered questions. The estate staff kept their distance, their polite smiles hiding an undercurrent of suspicion. Ivy could sense it. To them, she didn't belong here, and her presence was an anomaly that no one wanted to address. Arthur, meanwhile, grew increasingly obsessed with the mystery surrounding Julian's death. He spent hours in his study, poring over documents, photographs, and personal artifacts from Julian's life. Every so often he would call Ivy in, asking her to recount, in painstaking detail, how she had come across the necklace and the melody. His questions were relentless, and Ivy often found herself floundering for answers she didn't have. She was as much a mystery to herself as she was to Arthur. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Arthur approached Ivy in the garden. His face was pale, the lines of worry etched deeper than usual. He held a photograph in his hand, its edges worn from years of handling. This was taken 2 days before Julian died, Arthur said, handing it to her. The photo showed Julian seated at a grand piano, his head tilted back in laughter. A group of people surrounded him, some of whom Ivy didn't recognize, but one face caught her attention. A young man stood just behind Julian, his hand resting on the piano. His expression was guarded, almost wary, as if he didn't belong in the celebration unfolding around him. That's Victor, Arthur explained, following her gaze. My oldest friend, my business partner, and the last person to see Julian alive. Ivy handed the photograph back. Do you think he had something to do with Julian's death? Arthur hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know, but there's something Victor isn't telling me. He's avoided me ever since Julian died, canceled meetings, dodged calls, and then the necklace shows up, with you. Ivy frowned. You think I'm connected to him? I don't know what to think, Arthur admitted. But Victor was at the estate the night of Julian's death. He was the only one who claimed not to hear anything unusual. A heavy silence fell between them. Ivy's instincts screamed at her to walk away from whatever dangerous web she had stumbled into, but something about Arthur's desperation and her own strange connection to Julian's unfinished melody kept her rooted in place. The next day, Arthur announced his intention to confront Victor. He invited Ivy to accompany him, a move that surprised her. Why me? She asked, trailing behind him as they made their way to the garage where his sleek black sedan waited. Victor doesn't know who you are, Arthur replied. He won't see you coming. And I need someone with a fresh perspective, someone who isn't tied to the company or the lies surrounding it. Reluctantly, Ivy agreed. As the car wound through the city streets, she found herself clutching her guitar case tightly, as though it were a shield against the unknown. Victor's office was in a towering glass building downtown, its reflective surface gleaming in the midday sun. The lobby was immaculate, with marble floors that echoed their footsteps and an air of quiet efficiency. Arthur's arrival caused a stir among the staff, who exchanged nervous glances as he strode toward the elevator with Ivy in tow. Victor greeted them in his expansive office on the top floor. The space was cold and modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city. Victor himself was an imposing figure, his tailored suit and carefully groomed appearance exuding power. But there was a tension in his posture, a flicker of unease in his eyes as he shook Arthur's hand. Arthur, Victor said, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. To what do I owe the surprise? Arthur didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need answers, Victor, about Julian, about that night. Victor's smile faltered. Arthur, we've been through this. The police ruled his death an accident. I don't know what more you want from me. I want the truth, Arthur snapped, his voice rising. I want to know why you were so quick to accept their conclusions, and why you've avoided me ever since. Victor glanced at Ivy, his eyes narrowing. And who is this? A friend, Arthur said curtly. She's helping me piece together what really happened. Victor's gaze lingered on Ivy, and she felt a chill run down her spine. There was something calculating in his expression, as if he were trying to place her. I see, he said finally, turning back to Arthur. I understand your grief, truly I do. But digging into the past won't bring Julian back. Arthur slammed his hand down on Victor's desk, making Ivy jump. Don't patronize me, Victor. I know you're hiding something, and I won't stop until I find out what it is. The tension in the room was suffocating. For a moment, Ivy thought Victor might retaliate, but instead, he leaned back in his chair, a thin smile playing on his lips. Be careful, Arthur, he said quietly. Sometimes the truth is more dangerous than the lie. As they left the office, Ivy couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see Victor's men following them. Arthur, however, was lost in his own thoughts, his jaw clenched as he replayed the conversation in his mind. That didn't go the way I'd hoped, he admitted as they drove away. You think he's involved, don't you? Ivy asked. I'm certain of it, Arthur replied, but I can't prove anything. Not yet. That night, as Ivy tried to sleep, a strange noise woke her. At first she thought it was the wind, but then she heard it again, a faint scratching sound, like someone trying to open a window. Her heart raced as she sat up, her eyes darting around the room. The noise grew louder, and she realized it was coming from the balcony. Summoning her courage, Ivy crept toward the glass doors that led outside. She caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure moving in the darkness. Panic surged through her, and she stumbled back, knocking over a lamp in the process. The commotion must have startled the intruder, because by the time Arthur and the security team arrived, the balcony was empty. But the evidence was clear. Someone had been there. A crowbar lay abandoned near the railing, and the lock on the door was broken. This isn't a coincidence, Arthur said grimly as the guards searched the grounds. Victor's trying to scare us. Ivy shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. What does he want from me? I don't even know anything. You know more than you think, Arthur said. And he knows it too. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and tension. Ivy felt like a prisoner in the Kane estate, constantly looking over her shoulder. Arthur, meanwhile, doubled down on his investigation, pulling out old journals and recordings from Julian's studio in search of clues. One afternoon, while exploring the mansion, Ivy stumbled upon the studio herself. The room was a time capsule, untouched since Julian's death. Sheet music littered the floor, and the air was thick with the faint smell of stale coffee and wood polish. A guitar leaned against the wall, its strings worn from use. As Ivy ran her fingers over the keys of the grand piano, a sense of familiarity washed over her. She didn't understand it, but being in this space felt right. She sat down and began to play the unfinished melody she had hummed so many times before. The notes came easily, as if they were etched into her very soul. Arthur appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. That's Julian's song, he said quietly. The one you've been humming. Ivy nodded, her fingers still moving across the keys. It feels like it's a part of me. I can't explain it. Arthur watched her for a long moment before stepping into the room. Maybe it is, he said. Maybe that's why you're here. Before Ivy could respond, Arthur's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. It's another message. He handed the phone to Ivy. The text was simple but chilling. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The Kane estate was silent, but it was the kind of silence that hummed with unease, like the calm before a storm. Ivy couldn't sleep. The messages, the intruder, and the melody that haunted her thoughts had all tangled into a knot of anxiety that refused to loosen. She sat cross-legged on her bed, her guitar resting against her lap. The notes of Julian's unfinished song came almost instinctively to her fingers, as though she were channeling something far beyond her comprehension. The sound filled the room, but instead of bringing her peace, it only deepened her unease. In the study downstairs, Arthur was equally restless. The photo of Victor and Julian from the gala lay spread across his desk alongside old receipts, journal entries, and documents from Julian's last months alive. The pieces didn't fit not yet, but Arthur was determined to force them into a coherent picture. His instincts told him there was a pattern, some thread connecting Ivy, Victor, and the events of that fateful night. He just had to find it before whoever was watching them made their next move. Arthur's phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was a notification from his private investigator, Marco, who had been working quietly in the background to uncover Victor's activities. The message read, "Found something. Meet me at the Hollow Club. Urgent." Arthur's jaw tightened. Marco wasn't the type to panic, and if he was calling for an in-person meeting, it meant the discovery was significant. He glanced at the clock, 11:43 p.m. late, but not too late to act. He hesitated for a moment before heading upstairs to Ivy's room. When she opened the door, her face was drawn and tired, but her eyes were sharp. She was alert, like she had been waiting for something to happen. "I need you to come with me," Arthur said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Where are we going?" Ivy asked, slinging her guitar strap over her shoulder without hesitation. "To get answers." The Hollow Club was the kind of place Ivy had only seen in movies. Hidden in the underbelly of the city, it was a haven for the rich and morally flexible. Its entrance was tucked behind an unmarked door in a graffiti-laden alley. A bouncer, built like a refrigerator, gave Arthur a subtle nod as they approached, letting them inside without a word. The air inside was thick with cigar smoke, the low hum of conversations blending with the clinking of expensive glasses. Ivy felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes as they moved through the room, but Arthur's imposing presence kept the curious at bay. Marco was waiting in a dimly lit booth at the back. He was a wiry man with sharp features, his fingers tapping restlessly against the table as he scanned the room. When he saw Arthur and Ivy, he motioned for them to sit. "You took your time," Marco said, his voice low and edged with urgency. "What have you found?" Arthur asked, skipping any pleasantries. Marco leaned in, lowering his voice further. "I've been tracking Victor's financial records, and there's a series of payments that don't add up. Large sums of money funneled into shell companies over the past year, companies tied to known fixers and enforcers." Arthur frowned. "Victor's buying muscle?" "It looks that way," Marco confirmed. "And there's more. One of the payments was traced to an account linked to someone who worked on your estate, a groundskeeper named Colin McTire." Arthur froze. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Colin had been one of Julian's closest confidants, someone who had practically grown up alongside the family. The idea that he could be involved in Julian's death was unthinkable. Ivy watched Arthur's expression shift, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through his stoic exterior. "Who's Colin?" she asked cautiously. Arthur's voice was tight. "He worked for me for years. I trusted him. Julian trusted him. And now Marco's saying he's tied to Victor." Marco nodded grimly. Colin disappeared shortly after Julian's death. No one thought much of it at the time, just a guy quitting his job. But if Victor's been paying him off, there's a reason for it. "Do you know where he is?" Arthur asked. "Not yet," Marco admitted. "But I have a lead. An old associate of Colin's runs a repair shop on the outskirts of town. If anyone knows where he's hiding, it's him." The drive to the repair shop was tense. Arthur gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ivy could sense his turmoil, the silent battle between disbelief and anger playing out in his mind. "You think Colin's the one who?" Ivy hesitated, not sure how to finish the sentence. Arthur shook his head. "I don't know. But if he was working with Victor, then he knows more than he's letting on. And I'm going to get the truth." The repair shop was a ramshackle building on the edge of an industrial park. Its neon sign flickered weakly, and the faint sound of classic rock drifted from inside. Arthur killed the engine, and they stepped out into the cold night air. Inside, a grizzled man in a grease-stained jumpsuit looked up from under the hood of a car. His eyes narrowed when he saw Arthur. "Mr. Kane," he said, his voice wary, "what brings you to a place like this?" "I need to talk to you about Colin McTeer," Arthur said, cutting straight to the point. The man's posture stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Arthur stepped closer, his presence suddenly intimidating. "Don't play games with me. I know Colin worked with you before. I know you two were close. Where is he?" The man hesitated, his eyes darting to Ivy, as though weighing whether he could lie his way out of the situation. Finally, he sighed, wiping his hands on a rag. "I haven't seen Colin in months," he said, "but he mentioned heading to a cabin up north. Said he needed to lay low for a while." "Where?" Arthur demanded. The man rattled off an address, and Arthur didn't waste a second. He grabbed Ivy's arm and pulled her back toward the car. The cabin was deep in the woods, a secluded retreat that felt more like a hideout than a vacation home. The drive was long and tense, the quiet broken only by the crunch of gravel under the tires. When they arrived, the cabin's windows were dark, but smoke curled lazily from the chimney. Someone was inside. Arthur motioned for Ivy to stay back, but she followed him anyway, her curiosity outweighing her fear. They approached the front door, Arthur's footsteps heavy on the wooden porch. He knocked once, sharply. There was no response. Arthur knocked again, harder this time. "Colin, open the door." Inside, there was the sound of movement, a chair scraping against the floor, hurried footsteps. Arthur didn't wait. He turned the handle, finding the door unlocked, and pushed it open. The cabin's interior was sparse, with a small fireplace, a worn couch, and a table covered in papers. Colin stood in the corner, his face pale and his hands trembling as he held a gun pointed directly at Arthur. "Stay back," Colin shouted. His voice was hoarse, panicked. "Colin, what are you doing?" Arthur said, raising his hands. "We just want to talk." "There's nothing to talk about." Colin's eyes darted to Ivy, then back to Arthur. "You shouldn't have come here." "You're working with Victor," Arthur said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Why? What did he promise you?" Colin's grip on the gun faltered, his expression crumbling into something between guilt and despair. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "Victor, he has people. Powerful people. If I didn't do what he asked, I'd be dead." "What did he ask you to do?" Arthur pressed. Colin's eyes filled with tears. "Julian found out. About the money. About everything. He threatened to go public to ruin Victor. Victor told me to keep him quiet, but I didn't know." His voice broke. "I didn't know he'd kill him." The weight of Colin's confession hung in the air like a storm cloud. Arthur's fists clenched at his sides, his entire body trembling with restrained fury. Before he could respond, the sound of tires crunching on gravel outside broke the silence. Ivy peeked through the window and froze. "Arthur," she whispered, "someone's here." It was Victor, and he wasn't alone. The distant sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway made Ivy's heart race. She darted away from the window, her breath quick and shallow. "Arthur," she whispered urgently, "Victor's here, and he's got people with him." Arthur's jaw tightened as his gaze flicked toward the cabin door, now wide open to the cold night air. Colin, still holding the gun, froze in place. Fear radiated off him, his trembling hands barely keeping the weapon steady. "Colin," Arthur said in a low, urgent voice, "if you want any chance of getting out of this alive, you're going to tell me everything. Now." Colin swallowed hard, his voice cracking. Victor found out Julian had been digging into company records. Money was going missing, huge amounts, and Julian was tracing it back to shell companies Victor set up. When Julian confronted him, Victor panicked. He told me to follow Julian that night, to make sure he didn't do anything stupid. "And what did you do?" Arthur demanded, his voice growing sharper. Colin's eyes filled with tears. "I tried to warn him. I told Julian to let it go, to stop pushing, but he wouldn't listen. He was determined to expose Victor, no matter the cost. When I realized I couldn't stop him, I called Victor. I didn't know he'd Colin's voice broke as he choked on his words. I didn't know he'd have Julian killed. Arthur stepped closer, his anger barely contained. You're telling me Victor murdered my son? Colin shook his head violently. Not himself. He hired someone. A fixer, one of the guys he's been funneling money to. Julian was supposed to meet someone at the cliffs that night, someone he thought would give him the last piece of evidence he needed. But it was a trap. They made it look like an accident. Ivy's stomach turned as she imagined Julian alone, standing at the edge of the cliffs, completely unaware of what awaited him. And the necklace, she asked, her voice shaky. How did it end up in the park? Colin hesitated, his expression clouded with confusion. That, I don't know. Victor told me to get rid of it, to make sure it was never found. I left it in the river months ago. I swear, I don't know how it ended up back in play. Arthur clenched his fists, every fiber of his being screaming for retribution. But there was no time to process the confession. Outside, the gravel driveway had gone silent. Victor's men were approaching, their movements purposeful and quiet. Arthur's instincts kicked in. We need to move, he said firmly. Now. Arthur grabbed Ivy's arm, pulling her toward the back door. Colin stumbled behind them, still clutching the gun, though his grip was unsteady. The cabin's back exit opened to a dense forest, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. Arthur motioned for silence as they slipped into the undergrowth, the crunch of leaves beneath their feet muffled by the tension in the air. From the safety of the trees, Ivy glanced back toward the cabin. Victor's men were entering now, 3 of them, all dressed in dark clothing and armed. Victor followed close behind, his sharp features set in a mask of cold determination. He didn't need to speak. The men moved as though they'd been given precise orders. They're searching the cabin, Ivy whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur nodded, his mind racing. They'll realize we're not there soon enough. We need to put as much distance between us and them as possible. The group moved deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser with every step. Ivy's pulse pounded in her ears as she struggled to keep up. The forest felt alive with unseen dangers, every rustling branch and snapping twig setting her nerves on edge. What's the plan? She asked breathlessly, glancing at Arthur. We find higher ground, Arthur replied. If we can get a signal, we call for help. Marco can send reinforcements. And if they catch up before that? Ivy pressed. Arthur's jaw tightened. Then we fight. The forest eventually opened into a narrow clearing, the moonlight spilling onto a rocky incline that led to a small ridge. Arthur led the way, helping Ivy scramble over the uneven terrain while Colin lagged behind, his exhaustion evident. As they reached the top of the ridge, Arthur pulled out his phone, searching for a signal. A faint bar flickered on the screen. I've got something, he said, dialing quickly. Marco, it's me. We're at a cabin north of the city. Victor's here with his men. I need backup now. Marco's voice crackled on the other end. Understood. I'll get a team out there ASAP. Hold tight. Arthur ended the call and turned to the others. Help is on the way. We just need to hold them off until they get here. But before they could regroup, a loud crack echoed through the night, a gunshot. The sound sent birds scattering from the treetops, their wings beating frantically against the sky. Ivy dropped to the ground instinctively, her hands covering her head. Arthur pulled Colin down beside him, his eyes scanning the forest below. They've found us, he said grimly. Victor's men were moving through the trees now, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Another shot rang out, hitting the rocks just inches from where Ivy crouched. She flinched, her heart hammering in her chest. Stay low, Arthur instructed, pulling a small handgun from his jacket. Ivy hadn't even realized he was armed. The sight of it sent a new wave of anxiety coursing through her, but she had no time to dwell on it. Colin, still clutching his own weapon, looked like he was on the verge of collapse. I can't do this, he muttered, shaking his head. I can't. Arthur grabbed him by the collar, his voice firm. You don't have a choice. You got us into this. Now you're going to help us get out." The next few minutes were chaos. Arthur returned fire, his shots carefully aimed to slow Victor's men rather than hit them. Ivy stayed low, her breathing shallow as she clutched her guitar case like a lifeline. She felt utterly out of place in this violent world, but there was no turning back now. Colin fired a few rounds as well, though his hands shook so badly that his aim was unreliable. "They're flanking us," he shouted, his voice laced with panic. Arthur cursed under his breath. "We need to move. Follow me." The group scrambled down the other side of the ridge, the steep descent forcing them to half slide, half stumble over loose rocks. Ivy's knees scraped against the jagged terrain, but she didn't stop. The sound of footsteps behind them was growing louder. Victor's men were relentless. As they reached the bottom of the slope, Arthur spotted an old hunting cabin partially hidden by overgrown foliage. It was small and dilapidated, but it offered a temporary refuge. Inside, Arthur ordered, ushering Ivy and Colin through the door. The cabin was dark and musty, its interior stripped bare except for a few broken chairs and a rusted wood stove. Arthur barred the door with a heavy plank of wood, then moved to one of the windows, peering out into the night. "They'll be here any minute," he said, his voice tense. Ivy pressed her back against the wall, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "What do we do?" Arthur turned to her, his expression grim. "We hold them off, just until Marco gets here." The next moment stretched into an eternity. The sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and Ivy could see the beams of flashlights cutting through the cracks in the cabin's walls. Arthur gripped his gun tightly, his jaw set in determination. Then came the pounding on the door. "Arthur!" Victor's voice called out, smooth and taunting. "I know you're in there. Let's not make this any harder than it needs to be." Arthur didn't respond. He motioned for Ivy and Colin to stay quiet, his finger pressed to his lips. Victor continued, his tone growing sharper. "You think you can win this? You think the truth will save you? Let me tell you something. Julian died because he was too stupid to see the bigger picture. Don't make the same mistake." Ivy's hands balled into fists. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but Arthur's calm presence kept her grounded. This wasn't over yet. The door shuddered as Victor's men began forcing it open. Arthur took aim, his expression unflinching. "Stay behind me," he whispered. And then, all at once, the door burst open, and the fight began. The door to the hunting cabin shattered inward with a deafening crash, splintering into pieces as Victor's men stormed inside. Arthur moved like a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life, calm, focused, and calculating. His gun was already raised, and the first shot rang out, hitting one of Victor's men in the shoulder and sending him tumbling backward with a cry of pain. "Stay behind me," Arthur barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Ivy pressed herself against the far wall, her heart pounding in her chest as the scene unfolded in front of her. She could hear the rush of her own blood in her ears, muffling the cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Beside her, Colin clutched his gun with trembling hands, his knuckles white as he pointed it toward the advancing attackers. But fear froze him in place, rendering him useless as Arthur fought to hold the line. Victor's voice cut through the din, calm and commanding as he stood just outside the broken doorway. "Arthur, enough of this nonsense. You're outnumbered. Drop the gun, and we can talk." "Talk?" Arthur growled, firing another shot that grazed the arm of one of Victor's men. "You had my son killed, and you think I want to talk?" Victor chuckled darkly, unfazed. Julian got in over his head. He wasn't ready to play in the big leagues. You and I both know that. He was going to ruin everything we built. Arthur, I did what I had to do. Arthur's hands trembled for the first time as the weight of Victor's confession hung in the air. Ivy could see the fury in his eyes, but there was something else there too, grief. It was as if hearing Victor's words made Julian's death more real, the finality of it crashing down on him all over again. "You murdered my son," Arthur said, his voice trembling with rage. "And you think I'll ever forgive you for that?" Victor sighed, as though the entire ordeal was a mild inconvenience. "You're not thinking clearly. Julian was a liability. He would have destroyed us, Arthur. The company. Everything you and I built together. This was never about the company, Arthur spat. This was about your greed, your ego. Julian was trying to stop you from lining your pockets at the expense of everyone else. Victor's expression darkened, and he motioned for his men to advance. Enough of this. Take him down. The men surged forward, and the cabin erupted into chaos. Arthur fired again, taking down another attacker, but there were too many. Colin finally snapped out of his frozen state, firing wildly and hitting one of Victor's men in the leg. The man went down with a scream, clutching his wound as blood pooled beneath him. Avi's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the fight raged around her. She clutched her guitar case tightly, her mind racing as she searched for anything that could help them. Her eyes landed on the rusted wood stove in the corner of the room. An idea sparked in her mind, desperate and reckless, but it was better than doing nothing. "Arthur," she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "Get them near the stove." Arthur glanced at her, confusion flashing across his face, but he didn't hesitate. "Colin, cover me," he barked, pushing forward and firing another shot to force the attackers back toward the center of the room. Ivy moved quickly, grabbing a heavy log from the pile of firewood beside the stove. She swung the stove door open and shoved the log inside, her fingers fumbling as she lit a match and ignited the dry wood. Flames roared to life, their heat searing her face as she grabbed a nearby bottle of lamp oil and doused the flames with it. The fire flared violently, smoke billowing into the room as the attackers hesitated, coughing and shielding their faces. "What the hell is she doing?" one of them shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Everyone out." Victor barked, his composure finally cracking as the fire threatened to consume the cabin. He grabbed one of his men and shoved him toward the door. Now. In the chaos, Arthur seized the opportunity. He grabbed Ivy's arm and pulled her toward the back door, Colin stumbling after them. The three of them burst into the cold night air, the acrid smell of smoke clinging to their clothes as they fled into the forest. The trio ran through the dense woods, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The glow of the fire behind them illuminated the night, and Ivy could hear Victor shouting orders to his men as they scrambled to regroup. She stumbled over a root, nearly falling, but Arthur caught her arm and steadied her. "Keep moving," he urged, his voice low and urgent. "We're not safe yet." Colin lagged behind, his face pale and drenched in sweat. I can't," he gasped, doubling over as he clutched his side. "I can't go any further." Arthur stopped, his jaw clenching as he looked back at the man who had betrayed his trust and played a part in Julian's death. For a moment it looked like he might leave him behind, but then he grabbed Colin by the arm and hauled him forward. "You don't get to quit," Arthur said coldly. "Not after what you've done." They finally reached a small clearing, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance. Arthur crouched low, scanning the darkness for any sign of Victor's men. Ivy collapsed against a tree, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. "What now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen. "Marco's men should be close. We just need to hold out a little longer." But before they could catch their breath, the sound of footsteps echoed through the trees. Ivy's heart sank as she realized Victor's men had found them. They were out of time. The fight that followed was brutal and chaotic. Arthur and Colin fought with everything they had, using the terrain to their advantage as they tried to hold off the attackers. Ivy, armed only with her guitar case, stayed low, trying to stay out of the line of fire. She felt useless, powerless to do anything but watch as the men around her fought for their lives. And then, as the chaos reached its peak, a new sound cut through the night, the roar of engines. Headlights pierced the darkness as a convoy of black SUVs barreled into the clearing. Marco's men had arrived. The cavalry stormed out of the vehicles, their weapons drawn as they quickly overwhelmed Victor's men. The attackers were subdued one by one, forced to the ground and disarmed. Victor, realizing he was outmatched, raised his hands in surrender, a sneer twisting his lips. "It's over, Victor," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. You're done." Victor laughed bitterly. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won? I'll be out in a week, and you'll still have nothing." Arthur stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. "You killed my son," he said, his voice trembling. "You betrayed everything we built, and now you're going to pay for it." Victor's sneer faltered as Marco stepped forward, a folder in hand. "Actually, Mr. Kane has everything he needs," Marco said, handing the folder to Arthur. "Bank records, offshore accounts, evidence of embezzlement, and of course Colin's testimony." Victor's face paled as Arthur flipped through the documents. "Looks like you're not getting out of this one," Arthur said coldly. "This is over." As the authorities arrived to take Victor and his men into custody, the weight of the night began to settle on Ivy. She stood at the edge of the clearing, watching as the police loaded the attackers into their vehicles. Arthur approached her, his expression softening for the first time. "You did good tonight," he said. "That fire stunt was reckless, but it worked." Ivy managed a weak smile. "Guess I've learned to think on my feet." Arthur nodded, his gaze distant as he looked toward the horizon. "Julian would have liked you," he said quietly. "You remind me of him." Ivy felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. For the first time, it felt like they had taken a step toward justice. But the journey was far from over. There were still questions to answer, truths to uncover, and wounds to heal. And Ivy, though she had stumbled into this world by accident, knew she was now a part of it, a part of Julian's legacy, a part of Arthur's fight. And for the first time in years, she felt like she had a purpose. The sun rose over the forest, casting long shadows over the clearing as the chaos of the night slowly faded. Victor and his men had been taken away in handcuffs, their plans unraveled by Arthur, Ivy, and Marco's intervention. The police vehicles disappeared down the gravel road, leaving behind only silence. For the first time in days, the oppressive tension that had hung over Ivy like a storm cloud began to lift. Arthur stood a few feet away, his face unreadable as he stared at the horizon. He hadn't said much since Victor's arrest, his usual sharpness dulled by the weight of the night's events. Ivy watched him, her guitar case slung over her shoulder, her body aching from the exertion and fear of the past few hours. She didn't know what came next, but she knew nothing would ever be the same. The ride back to the Kane estate was quiet, the air inside the car heavy with unspoken words. Colin sat slumped in the back seat, his face pale and drawn. He hadn't said a word since the confrontation in the woods, his guilt and fear swallowing him whole. Arthur, meanwhile, stared out the window, his jaw clenched as his mind churned with thoughts of Julian, Victor, and the betrayal that had upended his world. When they arrived at the estate, the sun was fully up, casting the grand mansion in golden light. The beauty of the scene felt incongruous with the events of the past night, and Ivy hesitated at the edge of the driveway, unsure of where she stood now that the immediate danger had passed. Arthur stepped out of the car, pausing to look back at her. "Come inside," he said simply, his tone soft but firm. Ivy followed him into the mansion, her steps tentative as she took in the familiar surroundings. The staff greeted them with a mixture of relief and curiosity, though no one dared to ask what had happened. Arthur led Ivy to his study, where he closed the door behind them and gestured for her to sit. "You've been through a lot," he said, sinking into the chair opposite her. "More than anyone your age should have to endure." Ivy shrugged, her hands resting on her guitar case. "I'm used to it," she said quietly. "Life on the streets, it teaches you how to survive." Arthur leaned forward, his elbows resting on his desk. "But you deserve more than just surviving. You've proven yourself in ways most people never could. You fought for my son's memory, for justice, even when it wasn't your fight. And I can't thank you enough for that." Ivy's cheeks flushed at his words, and she looked down, unsure how to respond. I wanted to do what was right," she said finally. "Julian didn't deserve what happened to him." Arthur's gaze softened. "No, he didn't. But because of you, he's finally getting justice. And his legacy, it'll live on, thanks to you." In the weeks that followed, Arthur took swift action to dismantle the corrupt systems Victor had put in place. The evidence Marco uncovered was handed over to the authorities, and a public statement from Arthur revealed the extent of Victor's betrayal. The media was ablaze with headlines about the scandal, but Arthur faced it head-on, refusing to let his son's memory be tarnished by the lies of others. Ivy, meanwhile, found herself thrust into a world she had never imagined. Arthur insisted that she stay at the estate, offering her a room, meals, and access to Julian's private music studio. At first she resisted, uncomfortable with the luxury and the feeling of being out of place. But over time she began to see it not as charity, but as an opportunity, a second chance to find herself and rebuild her life. One day, as she wandered the halls of the mansion, she found herself drawn to the studio. It was just as she remembered, untouched, filled with Julian's essence. The sunlight streaming through the windows illuminated the sheet music scattered across the desk, the worn keys of the piano, and the guitar leaning against the wall. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, her fingers brushing over the piano keys as she sat down. The melody she had hummed so many times before flowed effortlessly from her fingers, filling the room with sound. It was Julian's song, but it was also hers now. She closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. Arthur found her there later, the music drawing him in like a beacon. He stood in the doorway, watching as Ivy poured her heart into the keys, her talent undeniable. When she finished, she looked up, startled to see him there. "You've made it your own," he said softly, stepping into the room. "Julian would be proud." Ivy smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I feel like he's still here somehow, like his music is guiding me." Arthur nodded, his expression pensive. Music was his life. It connected him to the world in ways I never understood. And now, through you, it's connecting us to him. As the days turned into weeks, Arthur proposed a bold idea, a benefit concert in Julian's memory, featuring Ivy as the headliner. At first, the idea terrified her. She had spent years singing in the shadows, her voice a secret she shared only with strangers in subway stations and alleys. The thought of performing on a stage, in front of an audience, felt overwhelming. But Arthur's encouragement, coupled with the support of the staff and the musicians who had worked with Julian, gave her the confidence to try. The concert was planned meticulously, every detail designed to honor Julian's legacy while showcasing Ivy's unique talent. The night of the concert arrived, and the venue was packed with people from all walks of life. Ivy stood backstage, her heart racing as she listened to the murmurs of the crowd. She wore a simple dress, her guitar slung over her shoulder, and Julian's necklace resting against her chest, a symbol of everything they had fought for. Arthur stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're ready," he said, his voice steady. "You've always been ready." Ivy nodded, taking a deep breath as the stage manager signaled her to step forward. She walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her for a moment as the crowd erupted into applause. She adjusted the microphone, her hands trembling slightly as she began to play. The first notes of Julian's unfinished melody filled the air, and the audience fell silent, captivated by the haunting beauty of her voice. Ivy sang with everything she had, her heart laid bare for the world to see. As the song reached its crescendo, she added her own lyrics, words that spoke of hope, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between those who refused to be forgotten. When the final note faded, the audience erupted into a standing ovation. Ivy stood there, her chest heaving as tears streamed down her face. She glanced backstage and saw Arthur, his expression filled with pride and something she hadn't seen before: peace. In the days following the concert, Ivy's performance went viral, her voice touching the hearts of people around the world. Offers from record labels and music producers poured in, but Ivy remained grounded, determined to honor Julian's legacy above all else. Arthur, too, found a renewed sense of purpose. He established the Julian Cain Foundation, dedicated to supporting young musicians and artists who lacked the resources to pursue their dreams. Ivy became the foundation's first ambassador, using her platform to inspire others and share her story. The Kane estate, once a place of grief and solitude, transformed into a hub of creativity and hope. Musicians, artists, and dreamers filled its halls, their laughter and music breathing new life into the mansion. And at the center of it all was Ivy, a girl who had once been lost but had found her voice and her place in the world. One evening, as the sun set over the estate, Ivy sat in the garden with Arthur. The air was warm, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. "Do you think Julian would approve?" Ivy asked, her voice soft. Arthur smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think he'd be amazed, not just by what we've done, but by you. You've given his music a new life, Ivy. You've given all of us a new life." Ivy nodded, her heart full. She still didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid. She was ready to face it, one note at a time.